How does the use of face masks and coverings affect our health? The pandemic brought their widespread use with little or no thought given to the respiratory hazards of masking, and those hazards are creating a public health emergency. It's time to assess how the widespread use of face masks has been affecting our health. The Vermont Emergency Forum to assess the respiratory hazards of masks will address these issues on Friday, May 12th in Burlington City Hall's Contois Auditorium, and you are invited to attend.
And this is what leads me then to Megan Mansell, who we're so happy can come in here soon to talk to everybody. And I just want to read a little bit about her. Megan Mansell is a former district education director over special populations integration, serving students who are profoundly disabled, immunocompromised, autistic, and behaviorally challenged. She also has a background in hazardous environs, PPE applications. She is experienced in writing and monitoring protocol implementation for immunocompromised public sector access under full ADA, OSHA, IDEA compliance. So she is highly, highly qualified, obviously, and we're so grateful for her to be here to be able to talk with us. I have to say also, Amy and I tried to get her into the Agency of Education at the Board of Education meeting. We talked to people, we offered her credentials, we tried to see, can you please listen to this woman? She can help them figure out the problem at the school. She can work with this immunocompromised child so these children don't have to wear masks and this child will be protected. This is what she does. These are her expertise. No feedback. No answers, no conversation, no follow-up, nothing. And this is the problem that we have because no one's taking action to figure out real solutions that are going to solve the problem for everybody and help. And that's what's actually heartbreaking. The other thing I would say just on top of all of this, when Amy had filed the public records request through the Agency of Education, and I think she mentioned this, but I want to say it again because it's huge. The Agency of Education has zero evidence of safety on masks. Zero evidence of safety for masks in children. You hear that? Zero evidence. Yet this entire situation is allowed to happen and is still going on right now. That is wrong. Every single one of us knows that is wrong. Yet no action is happening except from us as a groundswell, trying to make it happen and bring awareness around the problem here. And hopefully that will continue to move along and change, and the children will be protected because obviously they're being put at risk right now, and many people are allowing it to happen, and that's not okay. So before I hand it over to Megan, I just want to read one of Megan's quotes, which is one of my all-time favorite quotes. It begs repeating, and with great emphasis, that every mask you have ever seen on a child, is unregulated, untested, and unsafe, with zero efficacy, fit, term of wear, or medical clearance, standards zero. They are absolutely not safe, and we know that, and that's what we're all working towards on this. And I thank Amy so much for pulling all of this together. I thank Megan for being here, and all of you for coming out and doing the work that you're doing. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you for having me today, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I have 3 young children, and coordinating going all the way up to Vermont from Florida was just a little bit more of an undertaking than I could take on. I became very confused and concerned early on in the pandemic, especially surrounding our most medically vulnerable, who this was all supposed to be about protecting, right? Because we've always known how to do that properly. In your school system, you, without knowing it, have something called tiered integrated groupings, which everyone should have received a link today to a doc copy of my mini book, Accommodating Chaos, which addresses specifically how to appropriately tier out your accommodations, to identify your most medically vulnerable learners and staff members, and to properly accommodate them without it having an impact on any of the other learners in your school environment. We didn't do that. We didn't say, okay, who feels the need for additional accommodation, as we have done with speech or language or occupational therapies for every child under an IEP or 504 plan or IHP plan. Since the 1970s, we've always known how to do this properly. I've been over hospital homebound. I've been over undocumented immigrant integration, and severely and profoundly disabled student programs. And here's the point that we should start on. There is a place for every child in your school system and in every other school system across the U.S., but it may not look the same for every child, and that's okay, because some students have exceptional needs, and those needs may not be best met in whole group setting with 26 other children, where they are both a distraction to everybody else in that group as a behavior issue, or a child with significant needs, or someone who has outbursts or severe allergies. There are a plethora of different unique accommodations that we have always been able to properly integrate into our school systems, whether in self-contained classes, whether in classes built specifically around a student's specific needs based on buy-in and consent, or separate brick and mortar establishments where we are able to successfully accommodate our most challenging learners with people highly qualified to do that. We have schools for the deaf and blind. We have schools for severely and profoundly disabled children. And for learners who can't be safely accommodated under any of those other access points, we have hospital homebound and virtual school for children with stage 4 cancer who are still trying to be part of a school setting or receive supports in some capacity. But it doesn't guarantee under 504 or IDEA by any means that everybody is going to have this same cookie cutter educational experience, because none of your children are the same. And life would be rather boring if we all were. And so in knowing what it takes to successfully integrate the most challenging learners, both behaviorally or from a medical aspect, and in what it takes to safely do so, what I saw was just an extreme flippancy. We decided we were going to subscribe everybody to the same integration system. There was no identification, there was no accommodation meeting or period. It was just, okay, no matter who your learner is, we are going to strap this apparatus on them that is unregulated, untested, and unsafe with zero efficacy fit filtration term of wear medical clearance standards. You can tell I say that a lot. On your child for 8 to 12 hours a day. There will be no medical clearance or consent arm of this. These apparatuses have not been tested. They are not hazard specific. And within your public education settings, you're required, if you require your employee to don an apparatus for a specific hazard that you've identified in the workplace, for your employees, they have 15 pages of medical clearance and consent to go through before ever donning an apparatus. And your response must meet minimum mitigation standards for a hazard. So, and when we're talking about medically vulnerable children, we need that medical arm to make sure there are known anticipated hazards to wearing respiratory protection, which is why we have that medical clearance and consent arm. So for children and employees alike, there was really no pushback publicly when there should have been, because with any of our learners or employees, we have to make sure that a practice is both safe and mitigating before we implement it. So, I wrote a replica study of what children are experiencing in public school settings, and to show, 8 to 12 hours a day unregulated apparatus. They won't be monitored if they drop it or put it on a filthy surface. The mask won't be tested afterward to see if it was actually capturing what the designated hazard was that you were concerned about, nor will the child's health be monitored over a period of time that they're required to wear the apparatus. Doesn't this terrify you? Doesn't it terrify you of how this could be applied to so many other things, that we've just thrown safety out the window when every toy my children own, the paints that are used on them have to meet specific safety requirements. Their beds, their cribs, their bedding, their diapers, their wipes, every little aspect of what you get for children has rigorous safety concerns. Think about car seats. So one of the things I also did was I made a car seat out of cardboard and duct tape, and I brought it, and I had a couple of videos go viral because I was saying things in a way that I don't think other people were, from a position that I was more qualified than the people I was presenting to. And I got buzzered at 3 minutes, just like the rest of you, so don't feel bad. And guess what? They never called me back. But my duct tape and cardboard car seat, I said, this has zero efficacy or safety. It hasn't been tested. So do you want to go out and put your kids in my cardboard car seat? Because I have a hunch that it'll really save lives. It's the same thing that we've required children to go through, but there's been, nothing but this guilt and shame for non-compliance. And so early on in the pandemic, we had everybody saying that this was a droplet-based pathogen. So hand sanitizer, social distancing, the cloth masks that were nothing but a barrier, that is mismatched entirely for what this hazard has ended up to be. This is an airborne pathogen. More than 90% of your respiratory emissions are under 0.3 microns. And so nothing you see anybody wearing has been mitigating for that hazard range. But so the other thing that people were sold on really early, and the reason that I feel compliance was such a huge thing, even with children, is because you weren't told that this was for protecting you. No, it was your responsibility to protect others. Is Mr. Side Plume protecting me from anything? And here we go, not as much of a glare here. This is a double-layered cloth mask, and imagine sitting next to this man for the duration of your 6-hour flight. Are you protected from his exhale emissions? No, they're directed right in your face instead. So when you have respiratory emissions redirected like this, the more fitted the apparatus, the more pressurized your emissions plumes. And here is a character that I bet you guys are all familiar with, and I'm sorry, this is my phone, but Senator Bernie Sanders was, he was applauded for being one of the only people to be masking in the State House. And, he kept removing his glasses because they were fogging up. And why? Why is it that they were fogging up? Well, the apparatus that he was wearing has an exhale emission plume out of the bridge of the nose, because these apparatuses are not source control. And it's not just me saying that. The American Society for Testing and Materials ASTM standard specification for barrier face coverings F3502-21 Note 2 states, there are currently no established methods for measuring outward leakage from a barrier face covering, medical mask, or respirator. Nothing in this standard addresses or implies a quantitative assessment of outward leakage, and no claims can be made about the degree to which a barrier face covering reduces emissions of human-generated particles. As well as, importantly, Note 5, there are currently no specific accepted techniques that are available to measure outward leakage from a barrier face covering or other products. Thus, no claims may be made with respect to the degree of source control offered by the barrier face covering based on the leakage assessment. So they can't claim that this was for protecting others because there are no means by which to assert such claims based on our regulatory agencies within our country. Oh, how about this? Claims approval for children. This is on respirators and the likelihood of them being counterfeit, because NIOSH does not approve any type of respiratory protective device for children at this time. Unregulated, untested, and unsafe. Every single one you have ever seen on a child. I have 3 different articles that I wanted to share and kind of discuss. I publish on Brownstone Institute. All of my work is pro bono. All of my mediation and advocacy work has been pro bono. And what I've done is help people across the country who are having issues with their school boards or their states to kind of rally and to fight for appropriate and proper accommodations for their children or for their school systems. And so touching on the replica study that I had argued by an MD before IRB, which is an institutional review board, in order to conduct a human study like masks on children for 8 to 12 hours a day, you have to create a study proposal and argue it before your institutional review board as an MD. So I had a friend do that before her IRB in Arizona, and it was unanimously rejected based on anticipation of harm and ethical withholdings, as well as violation of first do no harm and a couple other things. So if you're interested in that, that article is called "Masks Were Unethical by Design." And then there's 2 other things that I get into that's what accommodating chaos is about. It's a dive into the particulate dynamics involved in particulate mitigation, and I try to make it accessible. It's very short. It's 126 pages at this time. But one of the articles I have that is included as an expanded addendum in the book is called "Why N95s Failed to Stop the Spread." And in that, I take the output of the spectrum of individuals who are contagious with SARS-CoV-2. We, at this point in time, have a way of telling how many particles are emitted on a per minute, per hour basis by a transmissible individual who's at various stages of illness, and then apply particle to PFU, which is how many of the particles emitted are viable virions capable of infecting people. And then I show the minimum effective dose spectrum of all current research for SARS-CoV-2. It's accepted to be between 1.26 and 363 viable virions for onset of transmission. And the reason why that would be a spectrum is because we don't all have the same health status. What it may take for me to get sick with a given pathogen is, likely to be different than, anyone else. And the other one is called eye protection wasn't misdirection. And the reason for that is you heard maybe the one thing that Fauci ever got right was when he was like, well, why isn't everybody wearing goggles? Okay, I'm not telling you guys to go out and wear goggles, so know that part. But if you were actually wanting to be in proper mitigating kit, your eyes drain into the back of your nasal cavity through something called the nasolacrimal apparatus. And there's actually been quite a bit of research done at this point on ocular transmission. The ocular pathway is a very potent method of transmission because there's not as much of a way of getting rid of the matter once it reaches the ocular membrane. And occasionally it manifests in an eye infection, but largely it's seen as a pathway for systemic onset from the respiratory system in the back of nasal inoculation. And so the reason I'm going at it from so many different angles is it all ties back to that medically vulnerable learner, that medically vulnerable individual within the workplace or the public sector, who this was all supposed to be about protecting. But we didn't ever actually do that. We never did anything more than basically heavy-handed make-believe while leaving our most medically vulnerable individuals fully exposed. And we never pivoted to the things that actually work. And I'm sure that Kristen Megan and Tammy Clark will probably touch on this extensively later. But what actually works is exhausting the hierarchy of controls, as is required by workplaces and public settings, which is implementing behavioral and engineering controls long before actual, real, hazard-specific PPE that meets minimum mitigation thresholds. So within the public sector of people who serve medically vulnerable children, PPE is often used, for instance, when a child has an aerosol generating device that they have to use throughout the day. It's pretty common with children who have cystic fibrosis. It would be part of their medical plan that they have to receive treatments throughout the day, and the employee who is administering those treatments would have to be under OSHA compliance for wearing mitigating protective kit while administering those treatments. It's not just, well, throw something on and we'll just hope for the best, you know. And for that learner, there's no guarantee that that child's best placement is among the general ed classroom. That child may best be served in a separate self-contained classroom on campus who may or may not intermingle with other classes during lunch or special area. They may receive separate transportation to the school or may not. But the goal generally is to keep the child somewhere on campus. It's called the least restrictive educational environment is the goal for that child. And it's not set in stone. Just because a child starts school as a child with autism who's nonverbal and has significant behavior concerns or needs that are unmet in the general education classroom doesn't mean that that child's educational supports are going to be the same for their entire life. Children graduate out of the self-contained programs, and children in the gen ed classroom are sometimes identified later on as being in need of additional supports. If we have a child with a peanut allergy, for instance, this is something that you get thrown at you a lot, and people say it without kind of thinking it through, I think. We have schools who have school-wide peanut bans. And if you do that, there's no name attached to it. You don't even know if there's a kid on campus who has a peanut allergy. But if you do that, then great-grandma packs lunch, and, well, she knows that, her great-grandson loves peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So then you end up stabbing an EpiPen into the kid's leg on a playground while you await the ambulance. Because it's not, it doesn't support an individual learner. There's no buy-in aspect of it. There's no consent. And the learner and the learner's needs are not identified or known to be properly supported. Or you say, okay, we have a rising third grader this year who has an anaphylactic peanut allergy. And we're wondering if anybody could commit to never bringing peanuts to school, and if you have them at home, wash your hands, brush your teeth, and change your shirt before coming, just to support this one named specific individual learner. Compliance, when you have people having an option to be part of that setting, is far better than when you just do a school-wide blanket, because then, well, what about the kid who only eats peanuts? What about if you know children who are on the autism spectrum, sometimes these kids have 3 things that they will eat, and that is it. Which brings me to the main point that within the public education setting, your needs do not trump the needs of anyone else. And the person who has used 504 to assert such, they absolutely have not spent much time in public education systems, or actually performed or written or monitored any or written protocol for any medically vulnerable learner, because that has never been the way that individualized education plans have worked in the past, and I don't see it working that way in the future. That's like, basically telling everybody that if a child in a classroom setting was having a behavioral fit, you just need to deal with it because you have a child who needs to express himself and throw chairs sometimes, and maybe that's a little extreme. But I think that everything got muddled because this was seen as people had good intentions. The wrong details entirely, but good intentions on how to help the most vulnerable among their school settings. And so we never really got around to doing that, unfortunately. And we didn't do that with our elderly either. We picked a measure, we decided to stick with it, even when it clearly wasn't working, even when the data showed very clearly that it was failing miserably. And what I believe to be the case is that they don't know what to do instead. And there are some voices that are loud and squeaky, and they want what they want, even if it doesn't actually fix anything, because they want to look like they're doing something and they don't want to let go of that aspect of control. And they would rather do the wrong thing than give up that aspect of control, because once that goes and they don't have anything else in place, think about what would have happened if we had waited till we actually addressed the behavior of the particulate, because we're just talking about particle behavior. It's not some big bad thing out to get you. For most people, if you're 99.8% of the population for a 99.8% survivability pathogen, this probably isn't of great concern to you. And I can already hear it. I'm going to have somebody say, but what about long COVID? And for that, I just wanted to put a bug in your ear. And by no means am I saying that post-viral symptoms and post-viral syndromes don't exist, but I find it a little fishy that there are 0 long COVID studies that exclude both long-term masking and vaccination status, because both of those have been shown to manifest in the exact same symptoms being reported by those who are claiming long COVID. We can't claim cause of one of those independent variables without excluding the other 2. And so just, that's kind of all I have to say about that. But I think that going forward for your learners within your school system, it's important that we go back to the way that we have always done it, which was to properly identify our medically vulnerable learners in a non-make-believe fashion. There's no shame in having a specific need, but there is shame in playing heavy-handed make-believe and leaving your medically vulnerable employees and students fully exposed with a false sense of security. Because there are children out there whose lives really do depend on us being truthful in times like this. And I'm by no means saying that's a large number of people, but this was all supposed to be about such a very small percentage of individuals to begin with. I think that the most important takeaway that I think that people need to see is how the apparatuses you choose have an impact on other people. And so I'm just going to go through and I'm going to show the exhale emission plumes from the different masks and respirators, because maybe seeing it for some people is more convincing than just being told. So these are different masks and respirators that you'll see. This is an unvalved N95, and that here is the exhale emission plume of an N95 at the bridge of the nose. This is double cloth masks, and as you see, the nose bridge plume and the side plumes out of the side. And so think about the different settings you've seen people wearing these, because I believe that by donning these apparatuses, you are kind of accepting a false sense of security that, well, maybe I'm not feeling well, but I'm protecting others, so it's okay for me to go out in public spaces, when that's false. This is a 3-layer cloth mask, and this is the exhale emission plume out the front there. This was the person most likely in contact with the novel pathogen at test sites across the country. And this is what the exhale emission plume looks like from this apparatus. Right out the front of the face, out of this valve, directly into your car window. And again, the person most likely in contact with the novel pathogen, wearing an apparatus that does not protect them from that novel pathogen, breathing this directly over your testing materials that'll then be stuck up your nose or directly in your car window. Tell me that's not a problem. We were not specific, and we just picked something and we wanted to go with it. And this is a surgical mask. Your exhale emissions go right through this, and aerosols take the path of least resistance, so it's either going to go through it or it's going to go out the sides, depending on the fit of the apparatus. Surgical masks have been shown to have 44% up to 70% particle penetration. Cloth masks, 97% particle penetration of aerosols. And there was a bit of data published by the CDC that I've never seen updated, and that was how 71% of new cases reported always masking, 14% most of the time. They're welcome to update that figure, but it's been pretty consistent with what I've seen. We have had randomized control trials around the world at this point, and the one that you hear people most often defend masking with is the Bangladesh. The Bangladesh study was conducted by an economics professor, nobody having anything to do with PPE. But credentialism aside, it was influenced under police presence in an otherwise resourceless village, in resourceless villages with financial incentives for compliance. And it's kind of an ethical nightmare. But the others that we have seen that very clearly show that they did not work. And I'm not even going to touch on the Cochrane RCT because it's a meta, and I don't prefer to go through metas without going through each individual study, and that would take till next week. But one of the ones that I think is the clearest indicator that this was a very, very much failed approach was the Canadian randomized controlled trial that compared N95s with surgical masks. And it showed no benefit from wearing an N95 over surgical masks in an effort to mitigate this pathogen. And the one thing that you'll hear people say in response to that is, well, people didn't wear N95s for the duration of their 12-hour shifts. Well, that's because wearing a respirator for 12 hours is outside of the safe terms of wear for that apparatus. It cannot safely be donned for 12 hours. And the answer in those direct exposure settings for this high output, this low minimum infective dose pathogen of such a small particle size was always, at a minimum, PAPRs, CAPRs, or SCBA units, which are, they have an independent air supply from whatever environment that you're in, and not just picking the bottom of the barrel respirators and throwing them on everybody and calling it a day. You know, it's embarrassing that we turned to medical doctors. It's like turning to construction workers and asking them to give details regarding their hard hats. They're consumers of a product, just like medical doctors are required to meet with industrial hygienists and OSHA professionals annually for fit-tested hazard-specific kit for each anticipated workplace exposure scenario. And so when you have your conferences with your school boards and they're saying, well, here's this local pediatrician who says masking's fine. Okay, hey, have you argued it before your institutional review board and had approval from other MDs signing off on this practice as a study as ethical and safe? And no, they will not have. And also, who do you meet with annually for your own fit-tested hazard-specific kit? Because none of them are signing off on their own kit, and most pediatricians didn't spend time in direct exposure with novel pathogens to begin with. Most of them have these small practices that they're just seeing kids with the sniffles or needing to give an x-ray or something of that nature. They're not working infectious disease control, so there's no reason why we ever should have trusted them as experts in this domain. It's normal here now. It's been normal here for a while in Florida, and on the internet, interacting with other people around the country, especially people outside of the country in places like Canada, where they keep pushing for this to come back again and again and again. It's bizarre because it's not here, and you deserve the same rights that we have here. One of the things that I warned about very early on when I was speaking with Dr. Naomi Wolf on her podcast, there is anticipated, known, established harm, both developmentally, socially, and linguistically for children for blocking tooth, tongue, and lip placement. This is the social and emotional center of the face. You need it for seeing how to properly pronounce your words, for emulating caregiver facial expressions and emotional copying, and one of the things I had predicted, sadly, really early on was you're going to see an uptick in speech needs. You're going to see an uptick in children with diagnosed autism spectrum disorders, because so much of the ASD diagnoses are based on caregiver reporting, based on linguistic and social development. So how many children now have an ASD diagnosis that was merely manifested from being denied the fundamentals of linguistic and social development? That's pretty huge. And the other thing that I think is important is sometimes these things are just irreversible. You're talking about set developmental milestones that may never seem natural coming from children who were denied this. One of the cases that I'm very happy to have been able to be involved with just because of the urgency of it, which is why I urge people to reach out to me if they are seeking public accommodation. If it's within your workplace or public school system, I'll try my best to help you, and if I can't, then I will put you in touch with people who can. But there was a boy in Wisconsin, and he was profoundly hearing impaired, and his whole class was designated to mask by their school system. So his caregivers having their faces blocked all day, all of his peers. Okay, well, his only access to language for anybody was sign language, which none of his teachers, none of his peers spoke sign language, and lip reading, and all of their faces were blocked. So if you want to read about that, the story is called A Child's Life in a World on Mute, and that's on Brownstone as well. And we were able to get him proper accommodations very quickly. But he, of course, started regressing, and it was just the most tragic of circumstances. You can imagine, of course he was having behavioral issues. He couldn't figure out what was going on any of the time. He couldn't hear anybody, and his everyone's faces were blocked, and just it's the saddest thing to me. It's the saddest thing to me how many people had this pushed on them without their will and their opinion ever being part of it. Our city, our county, made 16,000 cloth masks and distributed them to nursing homes and developmental care facilities. These are people with Alzheimer's and dementia. These are people who are profoundly disabled adults. None of them had any consent element to this as people who were, kind of past the point of consent or never able to reach that in the first place. But think about how many people had these things strapped to their faces who had no understanding of why. And I'm in Florida, but I'm in an area that was a mask mandating district of Florida, and I guarantee you not everybody had the same experience that I did. I'm in the capital city of Florida, but we have 4 other towns close by. So north, south, east, west directly are 4 other small towns. And population between 17,000 and about 35,000 for those towns. So the one immediately to the west of us, they were one of the first to implement a mask mandate. Our district implemented a mask mandate, and ours was one of the holdouts in Florida, going against the governor, going against the executive order to remove it from schools, going against the Parental Bill of Rights. And they were just stuck on keeping this when they ordered 350,000 adult-sized cloth masks as the only mitigation measure pushed in their school system. And you think about all of this endless funding and what actually could have been done to improve air quality within those within school settings here. But anyway, I had the option of 3 other towns to go to. That one is just over the Georgia border, 2 others in Florida. And in the past 2.5 years, I've spent about $18,000 in gas to have the life that I felt was appropriate for our children. And we didn't, go lick airplane bathroom seats or anything disgusting. We weren't engaging in high risk. We found like-minded others who, we'd go to the beach, or we'd go to the marine lab, or we'd go to playgrounds. And I had the opportunity to be able to homeschool my children, and it's nice because people don't bring their kids around others if they're sick, because they're not worried about missing work. It was honestly the safer approach for us, but my children never had to be part of this. My children never had to sit masked and distanced. My children never had to run laps for mask noncompliance, as was absolutely commonplace where I live. My children were never punished for not putting this filthy piece of nonsense on their faces. And I'm very thankful that I had the choice to be able to say, no, I'm not conditioning my children to fear touch and proximity of others from something that is very much being shown not to be a hazard to children. This wasn't the bubonic plague. This wasn't, this was a respiratory pathogen that largely affected people. The mortality rate for this pathogen, the average age of death was higher than the average age of death for citizens in our country on average. It's not it's not a burden for children to bear. And so I don't know of many people who regret, I don't know of any people who regret, just taking a pause and saying maybe the public school system isn't for us. Do I expect everybody else to do that? Absolutely not. You can't homeschool if you don't have a home. Not everybody can say, just one of us is just not going to work. Like some people are having a great deal of difficulty just keeping food on the table right now. And our public school system has always been just this lovely melting pot of people from all walks of life. And I don't think that the answer is taking that away from people. But I am also a supporter of school choice, because you have a per annum for state and federal dollars per child each year. And based on your matrix of services, I do feel like if your public school system is not properly supporting your learners, that monetary value should be able to follow your child to an educational setting that you feel as the parent properly meets their needs. But you should keep pushing back, and if you feel like your children are not properly accommodated in your school systems, know that they likely aren't, and know that there are people willing to help you seek proper accommodation, because the children should not have irreversible harms done to them based on adults being fearful of something that they're not even taking the correct approach to try to do something about. So I think I am comfortable ending it there. But if anybody has any questions or anything of that nature, I'm happy to talk.
How does the use of face masks and coverings affect our health? The pandemic brought their widespread use with little or no thought given to the respiratory hazards of masking, and those hazards are creating a public health emergency. It's time to assess how the widespread use of face masks has been affecting our health. The Vermont Emergency Forum to assess the respiratory hazards of masks will address these issues on Friday, May 12th in Burlington City Hall's Contois Auditorium, and you are invited to attend.
We're here at this moment to honor a family for courage, Michael, Lori, and Ryder Desitels of Troy, Vermont. When Amy asked me to present this award, I wondered why I was selected for the honor of presenting this award. Masks, I just want to say a little bit about what happened to me. By the way, I didn't resign. I was fired. I was discharged from my job. And everything I've ever looked at, and I don't claim to be a tremendous critical thinker, but it didn't take a whole lot of research to discover the studies and I didn't even know this, meta-analysis of those studies, et cetera, et cetera. And the conclusion seems to be that masks make little to no difference in preventing respiratory virus transmission. That seems to be the summary. I don't know why we're even here talking about this because of that. But so getting back to just very briefly about what happened to me, I was told that I had to attest that I had received the COVID shot or submit to periodic testing and don a mask at the workplace like a proverbial leper. I would be the only one with the mask on. At the time, we were into the COVID era 19 months. So that was March of 2020 to October of 2021, which is a period of 19 months. And as I wrote to my boss, at that moment we had 335 deaths in Vermont at the time that were, quote, COVID as a cause or contributing condition on the death certificate. That was the statistic at that moment of 335. So we turned the state upside down, impacted good people like the Desitels because of, I'm not saying it's I'm not belittling the death of any human being, but 335 works out to 17 a month or 4 a week. But the state didn't focus on the deaths so much. They talked about increasing cases. The cases are going up. Well, I said, and still say, I thought that would be good news, cases plus recovery, because there's something called immunity, right? It still is. Isn't that what a vaccine's supposed to do? Generate immunity? Isn't it better to get immunity naturally from the virus? To me, this wasn't rocket science. I'm certainly no scientist. But anyway, the Great Barrington Declaration came out, which hasn't been mentioned today, but I think is very important, and it was ignored and still is being ignored. And I want to praise the Desitels. I think we have in our DNA as people and as Americans that Declaration of Independence that was mentioned earlier today. Those 56 men signed a letter addressed to the most powerful man on earth, and they said all men are created equal, all are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So where did the rights come from? Not from the governor, not from the legislature, not from your boss, from some other source, your Creator. And they said those rights include, and they said these are self-evident, these rights are obvious. Life, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then what are we going to do about those as individuals? Well, we're going to create a government. They put it like, to secure these rights, we're going to institute governments. The people are going to institute the governments to do what? Protect those rights. Now, that doesn't mean you can't put somebody in jail, which impacts the liberty interest. So, and this is the lawyer in me, there are exceptions, due process. But Well, I go back to the first statement. Are the masks even effective, let alone necessary? So I'm about to turn this over to Mike and his family, but I want to mention two sources of news, the Epoch Times and Vermont Daily Chronicle. I think they're both great sources. And I saw an article in the Epoch Times that I thought was apropos today. The title was 15-Minute Cities Are Enslavement of All Peoples, an EU Lawmaker Says. Now, what's a 15-minute city? Maybe some of you have heard of this. It's where you won't be able to walk beyond 15 minutes from where you live, and everything will be in that area, and it's about government control. An author quoted in the article said, quote, "One day you'll be trapped in your 15-minute city waiting for a drone to deliver your sweet and sour bugs, trying to remember what it was like to be on holiday. You'll ask yourself, when did it all go wrong? The answer, when you applauded lockdowns and masks." So, and then in contrast to that statement, recently on a local television report that I saw, by the way, reproduced on Vermont Daily Chronicle, I didn't see it on the TV, was that, it was an article on the TV about the end of the COVID emergency. And they quoted a woman from Middlebury. Actually, she spoke on the TV. This is what she said. You just have to be aware, in reaction, what are we going to do now that COVID's over? You just have to be aware of your surroundings and who you're around. And if you need a mask, wear a mask. And if you need to social distance, social distance. I just don't get it. But I think that's our challenge, is people have been indoctrinated by the narrative. But unlike that woman from Middlebury, we're here to draw some hope from the Desitel family, who fought back on two fronts, at school and in the business world. For the first few months of the lockdowns, the Desitel family ran a business that was considered an essential business. It had to do with delivering and packages and sending packages, and they were permitted to operate. And I think I might have forgotten that at first there was no mask, no restrictions. Mike will get into this, nothing. And then this was pre-mask, pre-testing, pre-vaccine. Mike was rewarded for this diligence and courage by an edict directing that his business require employees to wear a mask and mandate the same for the customers. And he fought back, and some might say he lost, but he fought the good fight, and we need more people like that. And and then the school situation, which I hope they also get into, although that's a pending case. But anyway, I'd like you to welcome and applaud the Desitel family. And here, I told Mike I'd give him this, and then he's willing to take questions, and the family's willing to take questions. So let's hear it for the Desitels.
I'd like to say thank you. Not a great speaker. I don't feel what we did is anything abnormal. I feel like we did the right thing for what we needed to do. It was the right thing for the people, and I don't know. You don't want to talk? Okay. If anybody has questions, or feel free. For a while now, the good people are being punished and the bad people are being awarded. Just recently, this last interest rate hike, if anybody's heard, like they're raising interest rates again for borrowing, and now they're trying to push, well, anybody with a good credit score needs to pay more, so we're equally across the board. People pay attention to what's going on because they keep pushing this stuff to the good people.
I think it's time that 99% stops catering to the 1%.
I agree.